Institute for Professional Sales welcomes you to Pharma Sales 3.0. Over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the conference, and then Dean Kashyap will speak for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get started with the panel discussion. So as in 2011, large pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies spent over $6.5 billion just alone in the US on detailing, which is where companies spend resources on pharmaceutical reps who go in and talk to physicians, nurse practitioners, and provide information on the safety and efficacy or the effectiveness of the various drugs that are available in the marketplace. This process, which is commonly known as detailing, was really effective till the mid-2000s. There's increased sales for the pharma companies. Physicians had information on the latest products that were available in the marketplace. Except more recently, what has been found, there's a study by ZS Associates which indicates that just over 50% of physicians are now considered rep accessible, which basically means that they will see at least 70% of the pharmaceutical reps who call in and make appointments. And then we also have some studies that indicate that about 10% of the planned sales calls are just not converted into meetings because of the restricted access to physicians. The second stakeholder as part of this pharmaceutical conference that we're going to talk about are the consumers, the end consumers, the patients who use the drugs, the products that are from this industry. Along with the $6 billion that was spent on detailing, firms spent over $4 billion in terms of just direct-to-consumer advertising, which is also commonly known as DTCA. DTCA really took off only in the early 2000s because of some relaxed rules that happened by FDA in 1997. So in 1997, FDA said companies were allowed to advertise for prescription drugs with limited, with information on the product, specific indications for which it could be used, and limited information on the side effects. So you could see, and most of you probably have seen many such commercials like this over the last 10 years. But just like, the access to physicians, the media consumption habits of the consumers have also shifted considerably in the last 5 years. Most of us are using online media as part of how we communicate, how we understand and reciprocate from information that we get from companies. Now, as part of this, we've also seen that about 20% of all internet-related activities have now gone towards social media and blogs. So that is also questioning how effective DTCA is going to be over the long run. So bottom line is firms are really concerned how to increase sales, how to increase access to physicians, get access to consumers because of some of the constraints, the challenges that have been imposed. So who are the other most important stakeholders that you can think of? We've talked about consumers, we've talked about physicians. Anybody else? Who else should we be looking at as part of this conference? Anyone? So what we're looking at is the payers, and these have evolved in the last 5 years. These have evolved to have a really influential stake in how the industry is going to evolve. So this was a study that was published by a company called Monitor, and they had a survey of over 200 pharmaceutical executives, and what they found was that the payers, where we say payers, it's the insurance companies, it is the pharmacies, it's the employers that offer healthcare plans. Their role in terms of how the industry is going to evolve has increased considerably from 15% in about till mid-2000 to about 35% today. Similarly, we could also expect the role of the key opinion leaders have increased. But what is also startling information here is that the influence of general practitioners, the physicians, the PCPs we see regularly, their influence on the industry has dropped dramatically to about only 2%. So there's really little influence that these PCPs are likely to have on the future of the pharmaceutical industry. What we've also seen with the payers is a shift in what is the focus of the payers or the insurance companies. So far, when we looked at the consumers, when we looked at the physicians, their focus was on understanding the safety, the effectiveness of a drug. How safe is it? Is it, effective? Would it treat the plan, would the treatment work for the patients? But the payers actually focus beyond this clinical value. They also have an economic value that they have to pay their attention on. The economic value is to manage healthcare costs, because there is a huge pressure on managing healthcare costs, and this is where the payers come in. So restricted physician access, shift in media consumption habits of the consumers, and with an increasing role of the influence of the payers, the insurance companies, what we are going to see is a considerable change in how sales and selling evolves in the pharmaceutical industry. We also have the additional challenges that are imposed by a highly regulated environment, and we also have the global environment, the global marketplace, where firms are trying to expand to other markets to increase their sales. And this also creates new challenges and opportunities for pharmaceutical companies. So today, what we have is, there is a need to understand and look at sales and selling in the pharmaceutical industry in a new way. So to do that today, we have an expert set of panelists here who are going to bring in and discuss the role of these different stakeholders and how that is going to change sales and selling in the pharmaceutical industry. So we're going to start our panel discussion, the first panel discussion, which is on today's challenges and tomorrow's opportunities in pharmaceutical sales. And we have Rich McCauley, Greg Moyson, Cliff Moore, and Rudy Sharon, who are going to join us as panelists for this first session. In the second session, which is on social media, using social media to create value, we are going to examine how these different stakeholders, the physicians, the consumers, and the payers, how they are influencing the pharmaceutical industry and how they're influencing the use of social media in the pharmaceutical industry. And for this, we have Devin Iyer, who's going to moderate the session, and we'll have Sander Flom, Rich McCauley, Rudy Sharan, and Dilip Srinivasan, who are going to be panelists of these sessions. And as we get started with the panel session, we'll also have brief bios, and you'll have a little more information about the speakers for this session. So to keep the conversation in line with what we talked about in the role of social media, we want to expand this discussion that's going to take place in this room to give it to outsiders who are not able to drive to Wayne and make it here today. So I would encourage you to ask questions throughout the panel discussion, but you can also, if you have something that's pressing, you want to share it with the world and not just with us, then please use the hashtag RBI Pharma Sales. Post a question through Twitter. You can also use the Facebook page for RBI, and again, share comments, share questions, and we would be able to bring up those questions here and share it with the panel. So with respect to the students here, this is just an announcement. If you need to sign in for the PE sheet, the sign-in sheets would come along as we go through the sessions, and you'll be able to sign in right here in the auditorium itself. Now I'd like Dean Kashyap to come up and speak a few words. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Rajiv Kashyap. I'm the Dean of the Kazakh College of Business. It's really my pleasure to welcome such a distinguished panel of experts. And we're really looking forward to a very interesting set of discussions, both with the two panels. I just want to put in perspective where this fits with the college mission. As you know, we are in the heartland when it comes to pharmaceuticals and medical devices. New Jersey is the center of the world, of the universe, when it comes to that. And so it really makes sense for us as a college of business to reach out to our stakeholders and the community in order to develop those kinds of alliances which would enable us to place our students for internship or employment opportunities. In addition to that, we have a very special focus, which is the RBI, the Raspberry Institute of Professional Sales, where we are seeking to build out our curriculum in different vertical sectors. And we've started off thinking about using the conferences as a way of generating a discussion, a dialogue with the community in a way to try and shape our curriculum so that when you go out there, our graduates go out to the industry, they hit the ground running. There's no need for too much training, too much orientation from the pharmaceutical companies. Third, and more importantly, we are the university. At the end of the day, our stock in trade is our intellectual capital and the quality of the graduates that we produce. And so it's only befitting that what we want to do with this is we want to take this and we want to shape, we want to develop a white paper coming out of this conference, and we'd like that to set up a research agenda for the future that we can all work on together. Have a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. I also want to digress just a little bit and talk about really from a strategic perspective what's happening with this, with the pharmaceutical and medical devices industry. As you look across the world, demographics are changing. People are growing older and they're going to be living longer, which means that governments themselves are under tremendous pressure to contain healthcare costs. And so you're seeing a huge rise in the development of generics and a cost containment measures in force when it comes to medical devices. You're also seeing a whole plethora of regulations that have hit the street, which makes it much more difficult for sales reps and sales representatives to do their job because they no longer have the luxury of offering the kinds of promotional incentives that they used to in the past, right? So there's no more trips to Hawaii. I mean, you can't even offer them a fountain pen, a ball pen. You know, it's really difficult, and not even free samples. The office sends the samples to the physicians. So given, and add to this, this regulated environment, you have an unregulated social media environment where you can make those kinds of connections and try and develop some social capital to push your products. So this is a very, very interesting set of circumstances, and I'm hoping that our panel will be able to shed a lot more light on what's going on. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to now invite the panelists to come up, and we'll get started with the first session. Good morning, all of you again. Welcome, and thank you so much for attending this panel discussion. I'm going to start off by first introducing the panelists. I have the brief bios. I'm going to bring that up here as well. And then we're going to start with a brief overview of what they think are some of the key challenges and opportunities in the industry. And then we'll have a discussion through this. This is a fairly unstructured format that we have. We would like you to actively be involved with questions. Feel free to ask questions throughout the discussion. And you may also, the only thing is we have some mics here on either side. If you have a question, make sure the mic gets to you so that everybody in the audience and us can hear the questions clearly and the panelists can respond. You can ask questions to any one person on the panel or all of the panelists, and I'm sure all of them would have really interesting insights for us. So let me get started here. To my far right, we have Mr. Rich McCallie. Mr. McCallie is now Vice President Sales and Market Access with Braeburn Pharmaceuticals. And Mr. McCallie has spent over 25 years in the pharmaceutical industry, especially focused on sales and marketing, of which he spent many years with Bristol Myers Squibb, a leading pharmaceutical company here in the area. And his expertise is also Vice President, say, Oncology Sales as part of BMS. He's expanded over 10 different sales teams and launched 12 different products in his career in pharmaceutical sales. Welcome, Mr. McCallie.
Thank you.
To my immediate right, we have Mr. Greg Moyson. Mr. Moyson just started his own sales consulting business on Moyson Consulting, and he has also spent over 25 years, precise over 28 years in pharmaceutical industry with expertise in radiology training, and then he's gone on to work with Sanofi, where he was Vice President of Sales and worked especially with institutional clients. And again, he's also spent 17 years at Bristol Myers Squibb, so perhaps there was some overlap careers at BMS. Okay. To my immediate left on this side, we have Mr. Cliff Moore. Mr. Cliff Moore is the Manager of Pharmacy Services at Morristown Memorial Hospital. Mr. Cliff Moore brings in a unique perspective here for the panel, as he's coming in from the payer side, from the buyer's side for this panel discussion. Mr. Moore has handled including about 95 FTEs and has worked with budgets of more than $30 million in his career. He has also spent about 17 years in the pharmaceutical industry, again from the buyer's perspective. Welcome, Mr. Moore.
Thank you.
To my far left here, we have Mr. Rudraksh Sharan, or Rudy Sharan. He's Vice President Critical Care at the Medicines Company. Mr. Rudraksh Sharan has spent over 15 years in the pharmaceutical industry, and he's been responsible for various global brands in terms of their strategic development and launch, with particular emphasis in the cardiovascular products. More recently, before joining the Medicines Company, Mr. Rudy Sharan worked for Hoffmann La Roche in Switzerland, and prior to that, he was the global brand leader at Merck here in New Jersey as well. Welcome, Mr. Rudy Sharan.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So we're going to get started with the panel discussion here. Like I said earlier, please feel free to stop with any questions you may have for any of the panelists, and they'd be more than happy to answer the questions for us. So I'm going to start, we could go through the panel, and we could start with Rich. If you could just bring out and highlight what you would identify as some of the top 3 challenges that you see in the pharmaceutical industry. We'd go start with the challenges, and then we'd come back and follow up with the opportunities as tomorrow's opportunities, and we'll go and expand on each of them.
Great. Thank you, Sudha, for inviting me and you and your colleagues at the university, and a pleasure to be here. In terms of the pharmaceutical industry, and as many are calling us now the biopharmaceutical industry because of biologics in the marketplace, in addition to pharmaceuticals. And this would also probably carry over to many of the things we'll say to biopharma, to devices and diagnostics as well. This morning we heard some of the changes going on out in the marketplace, the changing demographics. Fortunately, and thank God, we're living longer, right? We're getting older, but we're living longer with that, and that puts demand on the system, on the healthcare system. You're getting changes in the products we have with many of what we call blockbuster drugs, such as Lipitor is one of the recent ones that have gone off patent. Those products going off patent, and now you have generics into the marketplace. So on the one hand, how does that affect the healthcare system from a lower cost standpoint? But now how does it affect the biopharmaceutical industry in terms of running our business and having the financial wherewithal to continue to invest in that business, which in biopharmaceuticals is your pipeline. And the products that you have in development to be ultimately reviewed by the FDA, and the pipeline that you have and the productivity that you get out of your R&D. And in the recent years, we haven't had the level of productivity as Greg and I were growing up in the industry on the biopharma side from a manufacturer standpoint of these large blockbuster drugs. We haven't had those. It's been smaller specialty drugs. You're getting more orphan drugs. You'll see that I believe it's around 30+% of those products approved every year have some orphan drug status to them. So that's a change. And with all this, there's the pricing pressure. There's the cost pressure. What we're seeing on the healthcare system, 2014, and I'm sure we'll talk about this some. Obamacare is going to be here, and accountable care organizations, and what does that mean for us as consumers of healthcare and patients, and what does it mean for us as providers of healthcare and those that provide from a hospital standpoint and those that provide product standpoint, but it's also the pricing pressures. You heard the P word this morning, right? And I say that respectfully as partners of ours, the payers. You saw payers are a key stakeholder. They're a key partner with biopharmaceutical companies, as are the healthcare practitioners. But coming together and partnering, and how do we work together to ensure that we're getting high quality, effective and efficient care at an appropriate price for that. So I think that's my top three.
Okay, thank you so much. Greg?
I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to leave right now because Rich has just totally depressed me. And
I was looking at his notes too, so I'm thinking about them too.
I'm hoping that we can talk positively, but just to continue, because I think Rich hit on a couple of really key things, right? So, I started in 1984 as my first rep job. The world was much different in 1984. In 1984, companies were growing and expanding. They needed people out of college. They ran job fairs. There was a different type of opportunity there. So now when we look at the number of reps in the pharma industry, it's actually vastly decreased over the past 10 years. I'm sure you're probably aware of that. When I look at the last company that I worked at up until December 31st at Sanofi as Vice President of Institutional Sales, we had 60% fewer reps as of December 31st than we did 5 years earlier. So when you talk about challenges, that's a reality, right? But there's still opportunity there, and we'll talk later a little bit about how you get your foot in the door. So companies are not hiring as many reps, right? Rich talked about the blockbusters that have gone off patent, and what we call the patent cliff is massive right now with products like Plavix and Lipitor and many others going off of patent. We're talking about billions of reduction in revenue for these companies. Right now, I believe the number is, if you look at just units, so pills or units, over 85% of all units in the United States are actually generic. So you say, well, wait, that can't possibly be true because drugs are so expensive. So what has to happen is that companies have to try to make up the revenue that they need to maintain their infrastructure and their R&D on less than 20% of the total number of units. So there are definitely some major things happening here. I think the other thing that we talked a little bit about this morning that Sudha mentioned was dollars for sales promotion. Dollars for sales promotion are actually starting to decline. Although they were significantly up over the prior 5 years, they're beginning to decline, again, because companies can't invest as much, but they can do it selectively, and I think that's what's happening. And finally, the only last point that I'll make is that when you look at the independent and the individual physician, that family physician that we all used to call on, that group of internal medicine people, dermatologists, right now, over 60% of all independent practices have been purchased by a larger organization. So if you think about that, there aren't that many independent physicians anymore, which obviously creates a more difficult environment for someone such as yourself to be able to penetrate that by going into the local doctor's offices. So if that hasn't totally depressed you, I'm going to pass it on.
Well, we are going to get to these, because these challenges, exactly, these challenges are going to create new opportunities for all of us here, and we're going to get to that. So the rest of the discussion, once we go through Rudy and Cliff, should definitely be more positive, and that's what we're hoping for as well. We go with Rudy, and then we'll come back to Cliff.
This is a topic I bet you all of us here have lived with for many years. I personally believe, I totally agree with what Rich and Greg have to say, but I personally do believe there is the biggest challenge the industry has, there's a perception challenge. And I think that's more so in the developed markets. If you look across the United States, you look across Europe, there's a perception PR challenge where the pharmaceutical industry is looked upon as a group of people who are there to really take away money from the government, take away money from the patients. So there is this negative perception which is out there. And every day, whether it be from an FDA standpoint, EMEA standpoint in Europe, you look at it from a regulatory standpoint in every country, the pharmaceutical walks in, the industry walks in with that negative feeling inside the room. And it's like they're guilty until proven otherwise. And this in turn affects payers, it affects consumers, it affects everyone. That are we being just loaded up with pills? And so if you look at the overall ranking, it has the most negative perception versus every other industry in the world. So I think there is a growing need, I think, as students here and as professionals here, that we understand one thing, that our job is to build that positive perception, that we provide health. We provide a positive message that we are in this industry for the sake of patients, for the sake of physicians, to advance healthcare. I think that's the first challenge. Second thing I think of is the sales model, like Rich, Greg, and Sudha, you were mentioning. The sales model has shifted so much versus the 80s and the 90s. I still remember when I started off as a sales rep, you would take people to a Broadway show, you would have a $600 meal in New York City, and then, you had trips out to Hawaii, and I think those were real, Rajiv, frankly. But that has shifted, and I'm not necessarily, I'm trying to say everything was bad, but at the same time, there is that dramatic shift that's happening now. And I think the pendulum has gone to the other extreme, where people have started believing if I give a pen that is worth 10 cents being brought in from China, and I give it to a physician in the US, he or she is going to change the mindset with which they would prescribe. And I think that sales model shift has really led the companies to think of sales in a very different way. They are moving to a direction where they do believe that the sales rep has no value addition. And then this whole model of blockbuster is changing. We are moving into specialty sales. So there are a lot of things that are happening from a sales model standpoint. And finally, not to take too much time here, is the global shift which is happening. That is for real. That is for real, and that is here to stay. It's not going away. The US market is the largest market. It's going to remain, no doubt about it. The problem is we have to become experts as an industry to venture into other markets around the world. And my last job in Switzerland was a striking reminder of the differences that exist, the expertise we have to build inside the industry here to be able to leverage the opportunities that are there in emerging markets, in Europe with the reimbursement challenges, and take it forward. So those to me are top three I can think of.
Thank you. Cliff, would you like to give the buyer's perspective in this?
So my point of view is very similar, but maybe I'm a little bit more on the other side of the fence in that I actually have to consume some of these products or buy them. And so some of the challenges that we're faced with in the pharmacy and some of the challenges that we're faced with today are very significant. Probably the most challenging right now on a day-to-day basis for us are the number of shortages that are on the market right now that are occurring as we speak. There are drugs that we just can't even get a hold of anymore, and it's really quite sad, actually. Injectable drugs, particularly in the pharmacy hospital setting, are being impacted very significantly. And so one of the things that you could potentially do as a salesperson, and the support that you could offer to an institution, is to know alternative drugs, know the type of drugs that can be used in place of products that are no longer available or for whatever reason aren't able to be obtained. And we talked about the amount of regulation that's occurring now. It's a very regulated market. The FDA is closing down manufacturers for anything that they can think of when it comes to manufacturing. And my belief is that what's happened over time is that as pharmaceutical companies have merged together, and as generics have become more of a they have a greater impact on the marketplace, there aren't as many manufacturers making particular drugs anymore. So in the past, where maybe you had 5 or 6 manufacturers making a particular drug, because of all the mergers that have occurred now, you maybe have 1 or 2. If the FDA goes in and closes down a plant for whatever reason, that will have and it does have a significant impact on the marketplace. So right now, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, and we're struggling with the number of shortages that are out there. They're talking that it's been, 4 times as many over the last 10 to 15 years. We have somewhere in the range of 250 to 300 drugs that we can't get. And these are the type of drugs that are real workhorses for us. It's not that these are things that we can sometimes do without. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we're faced with right now. We talked a little bit about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and what the impact of that is going to be. Health care costs have to come down. There's no question about it. We just can't sustain the current expense that we're driving through the market. And so we're all being faced with trying to cut costs down as much as we possibly can. So this is going to be a big challenge for hospitals, because what essentially we're going to see happening is that the change is going to occur from the inpatient setting. We're going to see moving to the outpatient setting. So hospitals will actually be reimbursed as we move forward in moving patients from that inpatient setting to the outpatient setting. So we'll actually be reimbursed on keeping patients out of the hospital, if that makes any sense whatsoever. But it's true. That's ultimately what will happen. And the good news, I guess, is that with the Affordable Care Act, there'll be more Americans that are actually insured. So there'll be more Americans that actually have access to health care. So that should hopefully drive some positive revenue through the healthcare industry as we make healthcare more accessible to the public. And then, not to get into a whole lot of detail, but I think it's relevant, and it really is kind of a challenge, I think, for everybody that's out in the audience, is understanding what happens in the hospital setting. And it also occurs in the insurance industry as well. You hear about formulary and formulary process and drugs being on formulary. As a sales individual, you have to know, obviously, the product that you're selling, but you also need to know what your competition is, because what essentially happens with the formulary process is that we try to restrict the number of drugs that we allow into an organization, I'll say, and the payers basically do the same thing. There are classes of drugs. So proton pump inhibitors is a particular class of drug, and there are numerous drugs within that class. What we try to do within the hospital setting is we try to restrict the number of drugs that we have in a particular class. So that way we can keep our costs down, we can keep our inventory costs down. But again, as sales individuals, you're going to need to know what the drug is that you're selling, but you also need to know the other drugs in that category so that you will be able to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of all the drugs in that class. So it's a true challenge.
Thank you so much. So we could go back and get started on the positive side, because now we have a list of challenges that are there in the industry, but I think these also create great opportunities and how the sales force can adapt to meet those challenges, and that's where we would like to hear from the panelists now. So we'll again start with Rich. You could address some of the opportunities that exist based on the challenges you identified, and the rest of the panel as well.
When I think of opportunities, it's from a couple of standpoints. First and foremost, it's innovation. It's innovation in terms of our products that we're developing through our innovation through R&D. That's where we've stumbled some, so to say, as an industry. And it's great to have this panel, because you're seeing, I'm going to talk a minute about partnerships, but a partnership from the industry side with the healthcare side, and Cliff representing that from a hospital, but the healthcare system, that piece of it. But how do you not be impacted by these manufacturing issues, plants closed down, you can't get drug, and what that means to a patient's potential life? It's the innovation in R&D. There's an opportunity for us as an organization, or as an industry. There's also innovation from the sales side of it. It's changed. You've heard it. You've heard how our industry is changing all aspects of it. So while we've gone from 110,000 or so to 75,000 or so whatever that number is, there is still opportunity for sales professionals out there. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as well. And within that opportunity, though, is what you're bringing to the table. And I think that's where, and hats off to the university for a program like this, that is what needs, Greg was 84. I'm not going to tell you when I started because he's a lot older than I am. But anyway, no, it isn't. I was 83. Okay, people, in 1983, the North Coast, which is Cleveland, Ohio, Lake Erie right there, okay? How we promoted our products through the years, whether as a sales representative and now being in really compliance guidelines we have, versus what is the role of a sales representative. Yes, there's relationship building. Yes, we bring in, provide information on our product and appropriately on competitive products, but you saw the word up there, details. Nothing personal, but I hate that word. I'm not a detail person. I'm a professional sales person. And how we've gone from detailing, here's some info, here's some samples, sign here. It's moved to consultative selling. Help me better understand your practice, your hospital, your integrated delivery network. Cliff got to it, right? Representatives of the future, starting now, it's not even the future, have to be capable of calling on an individual physician in their office, the nurse, the reimbursement manager, all in that office, the CEO of the group, right? To go into the hospital and talking to the director of pharmacy, the CFO, the CEO, understanding the formulary process, and being able to determine, okay, what are the needs of the patient, of the healthcare practitioner, of the healthcare system, and be able to bring value from your organization. If we as pharmaceutical companies don't bring value to organizations, ultimately that lead to economic value and high quality patient care with a focus on that patient, as Rudy said, it's going to be tough. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for someone. And the first line of that value, sales organization. We're the ones out there every single day talking to the healthcare system.
Yeah, I think as somebody who started not really knowing what he wanted to do, coming out of college, took me, I think it was 3 tries before I finally landed on something that I actually finished. I knew I wanted to be involved in healthcare. I knew I wanted to do some things that were science-focused. And so pharmacy school and radiology and ultrasound, nuclear medicine, cardiac cath, and many years later I was running a hospital department. The good news is you can still do that, right? You can still evolve yourself and transform yourself as you go. The other good news is we're still hiring in the pharmaceutical industry. So even though on the one side, right, we painted the fact that there are far fewer jobs, it's harder to get in, that's all true. But at the end of the day, pharmaceutical companies need people. They need qualified people. So how do you get your foot in the door? I was talking with a young lady earlier today, one of your alumni, who's in sales. And she was talking to me about sales in a different industry. And I said, that's one of the best things you can do, quite frankly, is to begin to think about what are some of the competencies that Rich mentioned that we're all going to talk about here coming up. So what are the competencies for the rep of the future, right? So the rep of the future, first of all, has to be a very patient-centered person. It's not about learning about features and benefits of your drug and going in and banging on the doctor anymore. It's now about understanding what a diabetic patient is dealing with, what a cancer patient is dealing with, what a patient that has DVTs or heart attacks has been dealing with. They end up in the hospital. They transition from the hospital back to home or to an assisted living center or a long-term care center? Who's following that patient? Who understands what that patient needs? And many of the people that Rich mentioned, the nurses, the discharge planners, the social workers, the geriatricians, those are the people that you need to be able to relate to and provide a value offering. So what's a value offering? A value offering is something that speaks to them in terms of the decisions that they need to make. So as an example, what's the comparative effectiveness of a product that you're talking about? How does it compare to the products that are already out there? What are the benefits for the patient? What are the outcomes? You know, when we do R&D in the pharmaceutical industry now, we have to have outcomes. We've got to show outcomes. I'm sure Rudy will talk more about that. That's his area, right? But you can't just say this is how you take it and this is the benefits of the drug versus another drug. What's it going to mean for the patient? And many of those outcomes are economic. So how does this product, from a value standpoint, and we call it PE, pharmacoeconomics, how does that work, right? So these are the areas that when you actually start to think about what are the competencies that I want to develop as a person, you need to be patient-focused. You need to understand how that patient moves through the system. What are the key things right now that we as a society are looking at? Cost, comparative effectiveness, things like how you're going to be able to bring value to that physician, that nurse, that patient. I think the other thing that I would say is there are many new positions that are being created as a result of these changes. At Sanofi, we built a quality initiatives team. These were people that had, some of them had a clinical background, some of them had an analytical background. They were all very talented individuals. They had one desire. They wanted to understand and help the process improvement of healthcare. And so we trained them. We put them through Six Sigma training and many other types of training that teach you how to go in and work with a customer and help them improve their quality process, because your customers are under tremendous pressure right now to reduce readmissions, to improve outcomes, to lower cost. That's Cliff's life every day. So there are many, many new positions. I think that what I would say as far as getting your foot in the door is, first of all, you need to invest in your education and look into some of these areas. There are preceptorships and internships available in pharmaceutical companies where you might be able to apply and actually do a project and get your face into a pharmaceutical company where people get to know you. And once they know you, they're going to want to help you. And so I'll just stop there because I've been rambling. But there are many, many opportunities on the upside. But I think the key here is to transform to what you have to do, bringing that comparative value.
Yeah, I completely, you know, whatever Rich and Greg mentioned, first of all, I want to say there is absolutely a total agreement with what has been told until now. Just building on a couple things that you mentioned. One is about, I want to second what Rich said, innovation. I think that is the pivotal piece. Just saying it is, we are bringing out an innovation is not going to be enough in times to come or even today. And the aspects related to outcomes and all the stuff, Greg, you were mentioning, I think those have become the cornerstone for anything and everything we do as we move forward. And that starts getting reflected into how we manage the process. So once we know innovation is key, getting outcomes data to enter the market is key. Now we know the model that we had until now is not going to work. It's going to be a complex sale. The reps, the salespeople need to have certain type of ability and capability in order to have those conversations, in order to do a sale. And the model is evolving more into a team-based approach, where the sales rep in the past was required to hit certain numbers. Even now they're required to hit certain numbers, but they need support from people in the outcomes area saying, can I give you a pharmacoeconomic story? When I'm going to see Cliff, as a salesperson in the industry, Cliff is going to ask me, do you have Is it going to be of value to me? I have a limited budget. Why should I have your drug on the formulary here? So I think the job has become very complex as we get more and more specialized. So the opportunity I see, and this is what I was telling PK right before we were walking in, that the opportunity essentially for a program like this is immense. Because going into a company, you're coming in with such a higher baseline knowledge of what the industry is like. And I think that gives you a head start. It kind of builds a trust factor that you understand what you're getting into. And from there on, you can build your credibility further in the industry. So I think going in is very important. If the value you can bring with all this knowledge and background is going to be of immense importance as you go in. What you have to be aware of is this industry is not going to go away. It is just changing. When people tell you Pfizer is laying off people, Merck is laying off people, other companies are laying off people, it does not mean, you do not get carried away with that negative story, because also a lot of people are getting hired. The nature of people that are getting hired is different. They have to be experts in the area. They need to understand the science behind. They need to understand how the model works, how they can provide value. That is the positive thing here, that a program like this with the background you guys are building is only going to help you and the industry in the future.
Thank you. Cliff, would you like to add some insights on the opportunities for
Sure.
bio
You know, I agree with a lot of what has been said, and just to kind of be somewhat of the devil's advocate, but yet try to give you an understanding of what your role would be, is that I deal with all of these companies, and every one of them has the best product on the market, and it's going to, you know, be as, you know, cost effective and, you know, changing to the way I do my business than anybody else's product. So I think that as a buyer, you know, you have to be prepared to be able to support my needs, essentially. You've got to be able to give me pharmacoeconomic data that's going to really prove to me that, you know, your product is going to be the most it's most cost effective. It's not so hard to sometimes talk about whether or not it's more efficacious, because there's usually clinical studies around to support that. It's really when you start getting into that cost effectiveness that becomes difficult, because you start talking about products being able to eliminate a surgical procedure, or by using this particular drug, it's going to reduce the number of days that a patient is actually in the hospital. And what does that mean to me? What does that mean to the institution if I'm able to reduce a patient's length of stay by 1 or 2 days? What does that mean financially to the institution? You should be able to tell us that. You should be able to give us that information. So it is very much a team approach to the way we have to do this, because you've got to be able to support the buyer in this situation with the data that they're going to need to make the case to buy your particular product.
I'm going to go back and just follow up on some of the issues panelists have already brought up, which is with respect to the shift. I know Rich already said he doesn't like the word detailing, but there is a shift that is taking place. Traditionally, it was the detailing model that traditionally worked, but now that we are moving towards consultative selling, could you actually, all of you actually, expand a little more about what kind of training that's being provided so that the perception of the industry changes, and how the new sales reps can start thinking about value addition and consultative selling, which is not what they may have read or heard about. It's typically still derailing what people are familiar with. Also, if you could expand a little more along with consultative selling, how does it change the compensation models as well? Because the detailing model was more in terms of, you know, the incentives, you sell so much and you have, you know, incentives that are optimized for that. But with consultative selling, you're focused on building relationships. So is the industry also changing compensation models to evolve with the changes in consultative selling? So we can start with Rich.
From a training standpoint, the initial training is different in that you're understanding, you're developing a selling skills model, a dialogue model, whatever you want to discuss it, of uncovering needs. So it isn't automatically going in and here's my product, here's what it does, here's the safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's more of what type of patients do you have? Or specifically for this type of patient, how do you go about treating that patient? So it's uncovering needs. What are the needs of your practice, as I mentioned earlier? And one of the things you're going to hear, which ties into what Sudha said earlier about, and it goes back to payers, is that I need, yes, a drug efficacy and safety. That's a given. If your drug doesn't work, and if your drug isn't safe, you're not even going to be there, right? So that's a given. But now, one of the things that you're being asked first is, how is it reimbursed? Is your drug reimbursed? Because if it isn't reimbursed, they're not going to use it, meaning that it's paid for via a commercial insurer or one of the government programs. So there's training around that, but going back to what are the needs, what are your needs, and then how can we offer, what can we offer? In the past, what was it? Here's my product. You got a patient with high cholesterol. Our drug lowers high cholesterol. There you go. Here's how much it costs. Here's where you can get it. We're reimbursed. Now it's how do we, particularly as we get to 2014 and accountable care organizations and the Affordable Care Act, of reducing healthcare costs, and that's medicines and the medical side of it. There's both sides of that. And understanding what else we can bring. Is it your, so it's your product information. Might you be bringing in your market access counterparts to better explain reimbursement? It's providing an 800 number that helps them get, so it's that understanding of knowing all those. So now it becomes more account management. I walked in the past, I saw the physician, did what I needed to do, and left. Then it evolved to I talked to the physician and the nurse, and then physician, nurse, and pharmacist. Physician, nurse, pharmacist, reimbursement person. So it's all that way, the process of going from one-on-one selling to the ability of major account selling. Even if you have a small group practice. I mean, in oncology, we call it the complete office call. Very similar to hospital sales, right? You walk through the hospital doors, I'm just not seeing a physician. I'm seeing the physician, I'm seeing the nurse, I'm seeing the pharmacist, I'm seeing the infectious disease control person, I'm seeing the person who's heading up P&T, the formulary committee. So it's that major account selling and understanding those relationships amongst all those stakeholders. And so that's how our training has changed, that we're providing training in those areas. And I would also say we're doing a better job of what I call the continuum of learning or continuous training. We're great at the initial training, right? Or the launch meeting. We're great. Oh, this was wonderful. Well, 2 weeks, 2 months later, we're just humans. So what's that continuous training that you have?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think a few basics, right? So Professor Workley gave us a tour of your lab, which is really fantastic. I think that the ability to sell is going to serve you no matter where you go and what you do. And what I mean by that is it's really how you conduct yourself professionally, whether you're talking to a potential customer or whether you're in an interview or whether you're trying to gather information about something you're working on. The basics are, number one, learn how to sell. You really need to do that. The second thing, I would just repeat the fact that you got to know your customer. You have to know your customers, as Rich was mentioning. and really have a background and understanding of the system that you're walking into. And so in hospital sales, you know, we have a number of folks that are part of a larger team. Some people specialize. We have, pharmacy liaisons. We have medical specialists. Their job specifically is to understand the medical aspects of the products, the disease state, the outcomes, the pharmacoeconomics. They don't sell, but they are there to provide the value to the team. Then you have account management teams. Account management teams are there to talk more from a payer level, from a contracting level, and a distribution level. And then ultimately you have the account manager, who is often the person that's kind of the quarterback, if you will, of that team, and is working with that entire team. Now, it's different if you're in devices versus perhaps selling drugs in the cardiovascular area or selling medical services, whether it's home monitoring services or whatever. So it's very different. I go back to the basics. Learn how to sell. Learn how to understand and do research around your customer. And then just to your question about the incentive compensation, yeah, it's changed a lot. For sure, there are still sales goals out there. So again, if you're selling a device particularly, you might be selling a pacemaker. And, you know, your territory did $2 million. Well, guess what? You're going to get a quota that's going to be more than $2 million for that year, right? And so one of the ways that you could potentially be reimbursed is if you're able to sell beyond that $2 million, great. As we transition in the pharma industry to the fact that we're now more team-oriented, we're more outcomes-focused, our incentives are also falling more towards the team incentive. And again, we might look at a geographic area and say, how are we doing in North Jersey as a team versus, you know, how is Martin doing, just himself? And that is continuing to transition. A company recently, a few years ago, decided to step out and try to do, customer surveys, and said, you know what, we're not going to pay our people based on sales. We're going to pay our people based on customer satisfaction. That's imperfect, but it was a great concept. And I think you'll see that we'll continue to move in that direction too. Just like every time you call your bank, they say, would you stay on the line for a 3-question survey? Ultimately, I think you'll see that patient satisfaction, customer satisfaction, those things are going to be incorporated into this bonus program or incentive program that helps add to your base pay. But we have a long way to go there. And, you know, again, it always falls back on how can you be objective and fair?
And when we talk about some of the things I just mentioned, it's not so easy, right? So I'll turn that over to, I don't know, Rudy or Cliff?
Yeah, you could talk about both compensation and training.
Yes, I think the training is evolving. It's an ever evolving aspect. It has not been stagnant, and I think it will never remain stagnant. The key thing to remember always is, do you have enough tools and resources? Do you have the inner capacity to build trust with your customer?
And I think that becomes one of the fundamentals, Greg, of what you were saying. Can you sell? Learn how to sell. And building that trust, can you provide value to your customers? Because if you cannot, in this restricted access environment, for example, if you're selling something into a cath lab for PCI, for angioplasty, and you're in that cath lab trying to sell something, and you have absolutely not a very good understanding of what happens in that setting, and you do not have enough knowledge of the drug. So there are a number of basic things you have to get right in order to be able to build trust with that customer. Otherwise, frankly, in this restricted access environment, the salesperson is going to be thrown out of that setting. And never again are you going to go back. So from a training standpoint, a lot of focus remains for the pharmaceutical industry to kind of build that trust level, build that knowledge base, And again, from a hiring standpoint too, a lot of focus is on, can this salesperson come in and build that credibility with the customer? So I think coming in the door, that becomes an important quality to have. And then industry tries to build on it to further enhance your ability to build trust with the customer. And that ties in with how people are really getting compensated today, because most of the big pharma, for whatever has been ongoing for the last several years, has become a lot risk averse. So it does not want to take risk from a legal and a compliance standpoint. So it's kind of making sure from every standpoint that you do not do something stupid which becomes a legal challenge in the court later on. You're not trying to sell things based on just trying to sell things. You're selling things based on facts. So a lot of training these days is to cover companies up from a legal standpoint, to make sure that they are not going into a direction where they are misutilizing the information they have. And together with that, when you start moving into an area about compensation, everything of this nature is getting reflected in compensation. Because now the model is changing, the specialty reps, frankly, from a number standpoint, are getting paid a lot more. Because who have an understanding of the specialty markets, an ability to work in teams, have an ability to build value, they're getting paid more. The stress is really, and it's not a black and white answer, is really on the primary care sales standpoint, where you're going and seeing a regular physician. It becomes all the more difficult, I think, and the industry is spending a lot of time and energy in making sure that a salesperson is able to bring value to a primary care doc. But the dynamics has changed so much. So there is a lot of stress there even currently. But from a specialty standpoint, the compensation levels have gone up. There's a lot of opportunity. So that's how I would kind of summarize it.
Thank you. So we're going to take a 10-minute break now. And when we come back, Mr. Cliff Moore would continue and actually give us some insights on how he perceives consultative selling